So thank you again, everyone, for joining. We hope that you had a great time in the breakout room and you got to get to know each other better. So the title for today's session, it might sound a bit dry and academic, but we promise the ideas behind it are not. So in the next 2 hours, we'll break it down into two simple ideas. The first one, participatory research, and the second one, research-practice partnerships. If you have never heard of these ideas before, you'll learn enough to join the discussion and begin imagining new paths forward for your own work. We hope you'll leave here understanding how these two ideas are actually very human and are a different way of understanding research that empowers you to make the changes you want to see. Next slide. So for today's workshop, we have four incredible speakers. Evan Cole. Evan has a rich history in the education of asylum seekers and refugees. He, as a member of Hack Your Future Belgium, he taught web development and programming. Further, Evan has experience as a researcher investigating how to perform research on computing education in new ways that reach a broader audience. Next, we have Professor Kula. She's a senior lecturer at the Open University in the UK, a university with a strategic commitment to social justice. They offer fully funded scholarships to people seeking asylum, refugees, and forced migrants. Professor Kula performs cross-disciplinary research on migration and forced displacement, where important issues and challenges related to forced migration and sanctuary seekers are addressed both theoretically and through engagement with local, national, and international organizations. Next, we have Professor Sarah Lee. She's a visiting senior lecturer of social research and public policy at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Professor Lee received her PhD in international comparative education and organization studies from Stanford University in 2022. Her research broadly explores how world cultural norms and global models for development become transmitted to local and national contexts to influence organizational forms, practices, and educational change. And last but not least, Yoshi Males. He is a PhD candidate at the VUB Brussels, where he is researching how to make computing education more accessible to everyone. He also worked together with Evan, teaching refugees and asylum seekers at Hack Your Future Belgium. Now I would like to pass it over to my colleagues.
Hello, Evan first. I'll just give you an overview of what we'll see in this session. So the first bit will be an introduction to participatory research. What is this? How does it work? Very high level. Then we'll do a similar thing with research practice partnerships, where you'll hear some ideas for not only what is it, but how do you start? What are the first steps if you're trying to partner with someone? Then the us talking at you part will be over, and we'll move on to a full group discussion. So we have some structure and guidance for that. We'll help you see how that will work. Then based on a discussion, we'll see what themes, what topics come up, what are things that a lot of us are working on, and we'll make breakout rooms for those topics. Then we'll get back all together and we'll discuss what possible collaborations came up in the discussions and also maybe could we think of for afterwards. We'll share out a form at that point and you can send your information, which we'll share with everyone who is here and wanted to share their information. If there's no questions on the overview, then I'll go right in to participatory research. There. So the first thing when you think of participatory research is to think about this idea of iterative co-creation. Often when you think of research, maybe the image that jumps to mind is someone in a lab coat, standing back, measuring, doing math, and controlling things. Participatory research is a very different way of thinking of research. You're really trying to work with the people that you're learning from and figure out together over time, what are the solutions that you can find for your context, and what can you learn from that to then share with others? So one way that helped me at first understand participatory research is to think in terms of all the people that are involved. So at the center, you might have some stakeholders who are actually doing the research. Those would be the people collecting the data, posing the research questions, doing the analysis, maybe writing the papers and disseminating later. And you have these direct stakeholders, the people that will directly benefit from the output of the research. So in the case of education, We'll see that in a minute. But it's the people that you would like to reach with your research. And then indirect is anyone who's benefiting from the research further down the road. So maybe you didn't exactly reach them, but because the people you reached are doing better, so maybe family members, those could be indirect stakeholders. So this more traditional view of research, where you have the lab coat and the observing, it'll place the researcher as the only intrinsic stakeholders. They're the people asking the questions. They're the people collecting the data. They're the people analyzing the data. And there'd be the direct stakeholders. In the case of education, that could be learners and teachers. Of course, there's many more stakeholders. You can also think of funding agencies. You can think of administrations. You can think of families. But just for this diagram, we'll keep it simple. We'll just think that we're studying education, and there's a classroom with learners and teachers. And there's a researcher who sits in the corner and takes notes, asks questions, and comes up with solutions. So this participatory research is going to flip that around a little bit. And you're going to take some of the learners and some of the educators that you're studying with, and you're going to actually include them in the entire research process from the beginning. Of course, not all. It's impractical to talk to every teacher and every student at this depth, but you'll welcome some members of the population that you're working with to help come up with your research questions, to design the research studies, to analyze, to write the papers, to disseminate the knowledge, all of the steps. So that's really, for me, this idea of participatory research. You're taking what might have traditionally been just the objects of study, and you're saying, no, you're also a person, and you have a lot of valuable insight and experience, so let's do this research together. So in some, participatory research is contextual. It's not a type of research where you're going to try to come up with grand theories of education that apply everywhere. You're really looking at one particular context, some particular groups of people, some particular schools, particular materials you're trying to teach and learn, and you're going to research that context. Of course, you can learn something that might be worth sharing later, but the primary goal is really that this is contextual research. And it's very relational. So it's first and foremost about the relation that the researcher and the practitioners have together. It starts with trust, it starts with understanding, and then from there you can start to ask better and better research questions. So you're studying a particular context, and you're starting from the relationship and knowing and understanding each other to see later where can the research take us. It's also a very dynamic process. This isn't the sort of research where you might come up with a big study design up ahead of time, apply it, 1 year later the study's done and you walk out. Because it is about context and it is about relation, it's a very dynamic process. So you'll often have to revise and adjust the research that you're doing as you go. And finally, it is about balances of power and resources and decision. So this is a huge topic. I put it there. There's a reason it's a longer line, because it's a very big topic. And that's what we'll learn a lot more about in the following parts of this presentation. So I'll just mention that these are very key. Even if you don't talk about them explicitly, these questions of power are always there. Who controls the funding? Who's asking the questions? All of this. And you can imagine in participatory research maybe a sort of ladder, where on the ground floor of the ladder, you have the researchers are in full control of the funding, the research questions, the carrying out of the study. And then as you go up this ladder to the very top, you might even have the researchers doing almost nothing. And it's fully the community that is conducting the research, and then every shade in between. So at this point, if any of the other presenters would like to chime in, if not, we can move on to partnerships.
I think we can move on to the partnerships. That's fine. So if we want to do some participatory research in which we want our stakeholders to partake in our research, then it's of course quite important that we have space in order to communicate with them and to do that. And so in order to achieve this, we will start a research practice partnership. And now, what we'll see today about research practice partnerships is not that field guide of everything you need to know, but we're going to cover some of the basics and give you some starting blocks so that you can know what to look for if you're going to go out this direction. The main key takeaway of this point will be that relationships, trust, and shared vision are the core foundations of this partnership. So, next slide, please. So, a very high-level overview of such a partnership will be that you're striving for a long-term collaboration. So that means it's not just a simple one-off thing, but you want to build a long, sustainable, multiple interactions. Okay, fine. So more in detail, that would mean you don't just apply for one small project 1 year or for 6 months, and then after the project got done or you're finished doing the research for that specific part, that you walk away. No, the idea is really that you settle down and over multiple follow-up projects, you come back and you refine ideas further. Now, that also means you want to give them a voice in the research, so you will need to have frequent meetings. It doesn't have to just meet them when you want data and meet them at the end for a debrief. No, you actually want to have them involved in the whole process. Now, one key point here is that this kind of collaboration is only possible if you actually do share a common future vision in where you want to go with your research. That is a similar vision that the organization that you're trying to work with has. Now, next slide, please. So the second part here is that we want these types of collaborations to really be able to improve and transform education. So that means this is not a way to go emergency that needs to be solved via intervention. This would not be the way to go. We're really aiming for longer scale, future-oriented projects where we want to see what can we do to change the way stuff will work in the future. Also, contradictory to some other research, these type of collaborations will never start from a gap in the literature. No, we will always start from an actual problem raised by the external organization or by the external stakeholders. And then we will supplement that real experience with the scientific background in order to get to a good solution. Now, okay. So one of the main things that was also mentioned earlier by Evan is that a core part of this type of partnerships is that you want to build a relationship. So you really should see this as building a long bond with that organization. And it's not just about you presenting them a solution. You're not going to go there and say like, hey, you should do this. It's also not supposed to be like you going there just to collect some data. And then once you have all the data, you need to write your paper to just go away again. Neither of those are healthy relationship dynamics. You really want to find an organization in which you can same kind of community norms, and this can be very broad. It can be the same beliefs, the same way of looking at the world, the same way of interpreting these kind of things, which leads into the follow-up point that you also need to have a good way to actually communicate with an organization. That means that you might need to change your vocabulary that you're used to of how do you talk normally with other researchers, and you actually need to be able to translate that research into a way that's applicable for real-life scenarios by those actual practitioners. To look back to the previous slides, you should have extraction at all costs. The idea is not that you're there just to get something out of that partnership and be gone. No, you really want to together build something better than both of you could build separately. And then for the last point, which is a very essential point, in these relationships, you do need to have informed consent. Now, the word informed consent itself says informed. All participants and everybody that gets in touch with the research of where you're collecting data from needs to be properly informed about what's going on. Now, this can only happen if they're actually fully aware of what you're talking about. So you should make sure that your research question and all the types of data that you're going to use or going to collect, that you actually communicate it in a very transparent way that they get. The second point to that is also that you shouldn't just get like an ethical approval form of the organization that you're trying to work with, but you should also look at the separate individuals that you're going to connect with. It's one thing to get permission from a school to do an experiment, but that doesn't mean that every individual student actually gave their consent to participate in your study. Also, you need to be very aware of power dynamics. Not all students might simply be able to say, I don't want to participate in this study if their school asks them to. And a final note on this informed consent is that it is a continuous progress. It's not something they have to give once in the beginning of the study. It's something that you'll need to re-ask and they can revoke at any time when they feel like they're just have been violated. So next slide, please. So now we can move on to what we call all-way capacity building. And the idea here is, yes, we're going to do capacity building, but it's not us going there and telling them like, hey, we're going to give you the tools so you can do all these things in the future. That's not what we're going for. The idea is that both of us, like both separate organizations, will learn a lot and gain skills and tools from this collaboration that they didn't have individually. A key aspect of this is what we call the interactional expert. And what we mean by this is that all stakeholders or all participants in these research projects need to be able to communicate on all subject matters that are involved in the project. So it really broadens your field as a researcher to learn more about the vocabulary and types of conversations practitioners have. But the other way around, we also want to enable those practitioners to be able to find other related research or give them ways of how they can incorporate research into their practice. Now, the added benefit for researchers here is that they become a lot more aware of specific context that happens in real life that they might not take into consideration if they're just setting up their experiments in a limited lab setting. Right. Then we'll go to the next slide, talking about how we can get started with these projects. And for that, I will pass over the word to Professor Lee.
Great, thank you so much. So, as she just really nicely kind of gave us this overview of the values and what it is, but then how do we really start this process of building out research practice partnerships? And as we kind of delve into this, I want to just remind us, right, there is no really right way to partner. There's no magic wand. There's no silver bullet, but there are some commonalities and common themes and best practices that we can pay attention to so that we work towards mutually beneficial collaboration. Here's the next slide, please. So as we just begin, I just wanted to kind of share this quote from the William T. Grant Foundation that talks about RPPs, because what we want, especially in context of innovation, education, improvement, social change, that we want a long-term collaboration through engagement with research. So the partnership, and I want to emphasize, need to be intentionally organized to connect diverse forms of expertise, both from the practitioners and the researchers and beneficiaries, and shift the power relationship in this kind of research endeavor to make sure that all partners have a say in this joint work. So how do we really get started, right? And from this kind of quote, we can ask ourselves these kind of 5 questions to ground us in being intentional about approaching RPPs. Go to the next slide. So before I'll delve into like the practicalities of how do we structure these kinds of partnership, I want to also think about these 5 questions, and these 5 questions can be grounding questions going forward in considering what RPPs are. First, right, is do we want to engage in a long-term collaboration between the researchers and the practitioners? How might we go about connecting diverse forms of expertise? Are we creating structures and opportunities that are needed to shift power relationships among our partners so that all people can have a voice? Who do we consider a partner who's not a partner? Is something that's really important in thinking about RPPs and the stakeholders that are involved is not only consider who is a partner, but who's not a partner in this kind of endeavor. And what does it mean to ensure that all partners have a say in this joint work? And are we there? Are we at a place where there's a mutual understanding? So these are some things we want to continue to think about and ground conversations on to be very intentional from the beginning all the way to the end cycle in pursuing these kinds of RPPs. So next slide. So then how do you really structure this kind of partnership? Structure of a research partnership often depends on what's already in place. Right? Often partnerships begin with each party agreeing to work together on an initial project, which they can get some quick wins as they establish ways of working together, and they kind of build it forward. And so whatever the structural origins might be, all partnerships at the end of the day, we want to kind of represent a commitment to a long-term, mutually beneficial relationship, whether it's researcher initiated, whether it's organization initiated, practitioner initiated, whether or not it's some sort of a research center or collaboration with the government, right? But whatever it may look like when we're structuring a partnership, sometimes because there's so much mutual trust and we like each other, we're like, okay, we'll kind of figure it out as it goes. But as a word of caution, just because it gets complicated and people have different stakes and different interests and different roles, it's really important in structuring the partnership to have some specific agreement that gives us structure and a grounding to move forward, whether it's an MOU, charters, operating principles and norms that you kind of create among researchers, practitioners, and other people that may be involved, so that people know exactly what the different roles and responsibilities are. And this also really helps kind of map out power dynamics and outcomes, right? So that we're not kind of giving power to one party over the other, but so that it really becomes this intentional co-design process. And so if we go to the next slide, as we structure this kind of partnership, how do we really think about developing a joint research agenda, right? So once we've kind of established a partnership, are structuring it, kind of identified who you want to work with, and thinking about these research questions, thinking about what we want to get out of this research partnership, we want to make sure that we root the research on real world priorities and challenges that practitioners face, right? It shouldn't be just for the interest of the researcher. It shouldn't just be the interest of whoever's funding the project, but really, okay, what are the problems of practice? Let's focus on that and collaborate from the beginning and integrate these kinds of ongoing communication throughout the process. And sometimes the real challenges and priorities shift, and that's okay, but we don't want to be haphazard and keep shifting the research. So you want to be able to have that communication and develop an agenda that is likely to be used. So even when identifying research questions, research focuses based on priorities and challenges, it's important to think about, okay, what's the end game? What's the outcome? Because we want to make sure that we're using the outcomes of this research and feeding it back into practice. And some things we just want to think about are some of the political realities and the evolving realities. We just want to be a little more sensitive to that so that we can navigate them well. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so as we continue to kind of have these kinds of conversations and create this joint research agenda, what becomes really important as well, and it can get sensitive later on and to minimize sensitivities later down the road, is in creating this joint research agenda, thinking about the different players and stakeholders in RPPs, it's important to think about developing data sharing agreements. And it kind of goes back to this idea of informed consent and issues of data privacy and ethics in research and in development work. It's really important to make sure that there is understanding both among the practitioners and the researchers and the participants of how will this data be shared, managed, and this becomes a good place to build trust. Right? We want to make sure that we do minimal harm to those we're studying, to those we are servicing. We also want to make sure that the data is used well, managed well, and published well in a way that is useful for the practitioners, but also advances research. So make this kind of data sharing agreements a part of developing the joint research agenda, a part of these kinds of MOUs and agreements that get made in the early on. And so if you go to the next slide, I'm just kind of giving you a lot of these kind of big, broad overviews, right? So if we think about, so now you have, identified your partners, you're structuring this kind of partnership agreements, you've come up with what are your research focuses and questions, have some agreements, dealt with the technicalities and logistics of it, which are boring and technical, but very important. We also want to think about, even from the very beginning days of starting out the research project, who is this for, right? And how do we want to communicate this research and engage stakeholders beyond just the practitioner organizations and the researchers? we want to consider these kinds of communication engagement opportunities at every stage of the work and start identifying who you need to reach out to and what they need to know. As part of this research is going to be disseminated to broader other practitioners that are doing similar work. Right? When we talk about migration and working with about refugee education, and do we want to kind of share these kinds of knowledge and gain insights in different contexts, different organizations, politicians, academics, other practitioners, right? So thinking about who our target audience is beyond just the internal relationship between the researcher and the practitioner for their own work becomes really important for defining the kinds of information that we're going to connect, how much time and resources we're going to allocate, because RPPs are quite time-consuming and time-intensive and requires a lot of commitment from both the practitioner and the researchers and other partners as well. So it's really important to kind of establish that understanding, continue to come back to it, iterate it, but make sure that everybody kind of knows where we're going from the beginning so that there are no surprises when you're actually doing the research and thinking about how do you kind of manage this later on. And so if we could go to the next slide, right? So, and kind of to reiterate these kinds of communications, right? When we're thinking about not only communication, but use of the research, from the very beginning of setting up RPPs, be very explicit about who's going to use the research for what purpose. Think about what kinds of routines and training, especially for practitioners, right? Especially if you're running NGOs, startups, organizations, initiatives, and are trying to engage with researchers to do research to help improve your work. Think about what are some of the routines that you do, what are some of your ongoing professional development training, what are some of the resources that you're trying to look for to help bring about your desired changes and outcomes, and create structures that are ongoing so that you're not waiting for the research to be completed in about a year or 2 years or whatever the timeline may be. But are there ways to continue to iterate, incorporate early findings into your work and have your staff participate and give feedback to the research, but it's an iterative, action-oriented research. And for the researchers, I think it's also really important to kind of go in not only as the expert, but also really as a learner, because a deep understanding of organizational context really helps researchers engage with research practice with partners, really understand what's going on, and produce research that's actually beneficial and of use to practitioners on the ground, and so that we can kind of collectively work towards greater social outcome. And just for kind of the last part that I would share with everybody, if we could go to the next slide, right? And this is just to reiterate what I talked about. There's really no right way to partner, right? There's lots of varieties of RPP objectives and capacities. Recognize and know that every context is unique, every partner is unique. The strength of your network and your existing relationships between researchers, partners, your beneficiaries, the people that you're serving, right? That all matters. So take what I've shared about these kind of best practices, how do we build and structure an RPP with a grain of salt, and be flexible and leave room for the unexpected, because things change last minute, new exogenous events happen, priorities shift, and that's fine. We just want to anticipate that and kind of leave room for that in even designing the RPP from the beginning so that it becomes a fruitful relationship and it doesn't become a drag as the kind of development things become difficult. So I'll end here and turn it over and kind of thinking about these kinds of similarities and unexpected partnerships.
Yep. So the idea of being open to the unexpected, that can even start while you're looking for partners. And so we're going to look at just 2 quick little thoughts for how you can look for deep similarities between your work and someone else's to find these unexpected partners, even if on the surface your work seems very different. So I'm going to lay out 2 different ways we can think of these deep similarities. The first is extrinsic. So that's outside of you as an organization. So this is the people that you're studying and the context that you're studying. And the second is going to be intrinsic. So that's within your organization. So if you look more closely at this idea of extrinsic similarities, you might find that, for example, you're teaching web development to refugees, and there's a community college that's teaching a different type of software development to their students. On the surface, that might feel very different. But if you look at the aspects of the people that you're working with that are relevant to your research, you might find that this nonprofit teaching web development and this community college actually have a lot in common. Maybe both of their learners are working and studying at the same time. Maybe both of their learners have English as a second language. Both of their learners may not have college backgrounds. So look at the aspects of the people that you're working with that are relevant to what you're trying to achieve, rather than maybe the bigger labels that you could apply to these people. And in the same way, think of the constraints that are faced in your context. So like if you're teaching, an important constraint might be internet or electricity availability. Is that constant or is that not? So rather than saying the words like I'm working in a camp, you might rather say I'm working somewhere where electricity is inconsistent, where the internet is inconsistent, and really highlight the constraints that are very relevant to your solutions rather than some bigger label on top of the context to where you're working. And then inside of your organization and of potential partners, think very clearly about the capabilities of your core team and theirs. Are they complementary? Are they overlapping? It might not be productive to, for example, if you have a lot of very good technical skills in your organization and the other partner organization is also strong in technical skills, maybe that works, maybe that doesn't, but take a moment to think about that. Go like beyond the landing page of your partner and ask who is in that team. What are their capabilities and how are they complementary to ours? And similarly for operational, we've heard from, especially from Professor Lee, quite a bit about things like paperwork. She didn't necessarily say the word paperwork, but like what are the formal agreements that need to happen between the organizations? How do they make decisions? Who do they have to pass through before they make those decisions? So just operationally, how does your organization and a potential partner operate? Is it compatible? Do you work on very different timelines? Do you have to go through very different hoops and red tape before you can start anything? So not to say that there's a right or a wrong way to find a partner, but just to say look more deeply inside of the work that your partner does and how their organization runs, rather than just the surface level of maybe what label do they put on their learners, or are they an NGO, are they for-profit, are they an academic? Those can often be a shallow similarity that's actually not meaningful when it comes to a long-term, closer partnership. So yeah, keep an eye out for unexpected partners, have an open mind, and look for organizations that might have deep similarities, but actually do have shallow differences. Because an organization that has those shallow differences will be coming from a slightly different perspective. They might have something to share that you didn't expect, and you'll have a much richer partnership and more creative solutions if you're pulling from different experiences. I'll hand over to Yoshi, who will introduce our discussion.
All right, thank you, Evan. That concludes the parts of the session in which we are going to present, and now we're going to make it a lot more interactive. So Evan, can you show me the next slide, please? So when I'm done talking, my amazing technical assistant will paste a link in chat that you can click, and it will open a mural board. Now on that mural board, there will be different sections, and it will become very clear. At the top, there is a section for introducing yourself. And for the first 5 minutes, I would like you all to think about, I hope you don't have to think long about your name, but type of education, what are the special needs, what are the categories, what are the age groups. So take 5 minutes to introduce yourself in a post-it note. Make sure to cover at least these 4 categories, but feel free to add any more that you want. Then next slide, please.
I just thought of one little thing. If you're here and not involved in education, that's okay. Just write what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine as well. So after the welcome board, where you should, after you introduce yourself, you can scroll a bit down and you'll see this orthogonal axis system that labels past, future, ideal, and problematic. And now we'd like you all to reflect for at least another 5 minutes about all types of, the questions will also be posted again when we go live, don't worry about that. So we would like you to think again for 5 minutes to reflect about any type of maybe practitioner context you've been involved in where somebody else came and tried to do some research, or maybe where you tried to collaborate in the past with practitioners as a researcher. And I'd like you to think both about stuff that went well and stuff that didn't go well. So if you had an experience that you felt like was really good in the past, I would like you to place a post describing that experience and some key takeaways in the top left corner. Then if you maybe had like some bad experience or something didn't go as expected or you were unhappy with the results, you can put it in the bottom left. Of course. And then I would also like for the future that you think about what do you think would be a more ideal research practice or partnership or a more ideal scenario. But here, be very specific about what could make it good in your specific context. It doesn't have to make it the best general research practitioner partnership. You should really feel about the you feel like in your context would result in a really good partnership. So we'll leave here for 10 minutes. We'll put the link in the chat. Maybe Evan, go back to the slide with the questions or through the board, that's fine. And
We can put the questions on the board.
Yes. All right. So we'll add the questions to the board. Please, you should be able to, in using, just by providing an email, add a post-it note introducing yourself, and really try to, especially for the second part, to really take time to reflect. We have time, think about it, and try to be as specific as possible, as Evan mentioned earlier. The more specific we are, the more we can see maybe what do we have in common. So thank you, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes after you filled in the notes. All right, as we are approaching the end of our first 5 minutes, I would like to invite all of you to move on to the next section, reflection, and write about at least one experience in the past that was maybe ideal, maybe problematic, and also try to envision about one scenario that you hope will be maybe ideal in the future, what could be ideal in the future, what do you think, what are you maybe experiencing that you fear might be problematic in the future. And as we are doing this, and you're maybe also looking at the other post-its by other candidates, I would also invite you, if any question comes to mind, it can be very broad, please feel free to add it to the right, the section where we have discussion questions, and we can take those questions later on as input for future discussions. So with that being said, please take another 5 minutes to calmly reflect. If you come up with any questions, feel free to add. All right, that concludes our 5 minutes in the separate breakout, in the filling in the board. So please all join us again in the camera, and we can look at some of the common themes or maybe some of the experiences that you have experienced in the past and try to find some common things. So I have one question. There is a post-it note on the problematic access, like in the future, describing implementing of findings and recommendations of research by local stakeholders. I don't know who created the note, but maybe the author can clarify. Do they mean that they feel like the work will not properly be implemented, or the way it will be implemented is problematic? If the author is willing to share. Otherwise, we can also see some common questions we've seen related to post-it notes. Is like, how can we get our refugees involved so they actually get more out of it? Like, how do we incentivize them to actually be interested type of research? So maybe somebody from our speakers could try to come up with an answer to that, or want to give a comment on that?
That could be the subject of a research project, which could be done in partnership.
So, Kola, you have worked in the past with in similar projects, so can you maybe give from your experience? Yeah.
Yes, Yoshi, will you be able to point me to the question? Sorry, I missed that because I was writing.
Yes, maybe Evan, can you zoom in a bit on the questions? Yes. So it's the second point where they're actually asking, how do we get refugees involved in the project so they actually get more out of it? So I think the question is more related to how do we get enough buy-in from them so they actually contribute enough so that you can adapt your research or your inputs towards them?
Yes, I can draw on a couple of examples really, Yoshi, here. At least things and mechanisms that we used to actually try to recruit and try to work with refugees in our projects. First of all, I think partnerships are really essential. For example, we are based in the UK. I'm a UK-based researcher. So in that case, really identifying partners that are really active in the field and they know more about their context really, and develop those partnerships, because there is a win-win. Everyone is really trying to achieve something through this partnership. So, for example, in a project that I was leading in Jordan, we were working with 2 local NGOs. They were working with refugees themselves. This was funding that I had, but we kind of like made sure that actually the people were compensated for their time. So we treated this as a kind of like a job description. We were very clear at the beginning. We had like a couple of orientation meetings and drop-in sessions where we were explaining why we're doing this, what's the point of this research. We were very clear what their involvement would be like, and the hours that they had to commit really to this piece of work. And then there was a kind of like I'm not going to say contract, but there was an agreement made between these NGOs and refugees themselves. And of course, this brought other opportunities afterwards for references. This was treated as a work experience, really, and so on. So again, as I said, partnerships are really essential in this case. I know that it is quite problematic when we think about payment in research projects, but I think the biggest issue here is really working with people who are vulnerable, they are disadvantaged. And I think if we can build in this funding really as part of our work, as part of the application, as part of the funding application, I would say that this is really a sensible way to go about it in this case.
Thank you.
I was trying to think of what else is there. One thing that I kind of like learned along the way, and I think it relates to the discussion we had yesterday, is that we need to be very clear in terms of what we are promising refugees, in terms of what they're getting out of this project. We can't really overpromise. We're not really changing their life here. We're not changing their conditions. So we really should be transparent, and we will always find people that are very keen to participate in projects, because they feel that they're developing their skills, they feel that they're giving back to their community, they feel that this serves their longer-term vision and aspirations. But of course, we can't say that by participating in a project, this is going to be life-changing. It could be a game changer, but I think we really need to be careful in terms of promises we're making.
Thank you. Prof, is there maybe something from your side? In your context, it hasn't been with refugees, but you do have experience having these types of projects with other stakeholders. Can you maybe elaborate on how you would normally approach getting buy-in from the external partners?
Yeah, I think a lot of times and I think it's quite similar to what was already shared in terms of getting buy-in from external partners, is like in many ways, it's really just about like getting the buy-in process, like really communicating the value add, right? What's the purpose of it? What's the benefit of it? But also being very honest and realistic about what the projected benefits and outcomes are, right? Not over-promising, but helping people kind of see the value of it. And I think a lot of times when we're working with external partners, it's really important to talk about it and frame the value around, what are some of the biggest needs or concerns. So those are kind of big things to think about. I would just stop there for now. I think it's so context specific, but a big theme is let's not overpromise, but be very honest about, and be very clear and explicit about what your value added and what's the point of these partnerships, and actually laying some of those strategies out even before you engage with external partners is helpful. And even really understanding what the purposes are is really helpful to kind of go back to the question of like, who do you partner with, who do you not partner with, right? So that you're not tempted with just like engaging in partnerships for the sake of partnerships. So I think a lot of times if we go with that approach, then you're going to kind of end up in a lot of these slightly problematic or challenging circumstances.
Thank you for that. Another point I see coming back multiple times in the questions is that a lot of the academic funding is really tied to doing research or getting a paper out of it. But very often in those projects, the amount of money you can use to pay external organizations or to invest in infrastructure or to invest in development is quite limited. So in your experiences, have you found ways of how we can, with the typical funding strategies in the academic world, how we can still try to build these long-lasting projects that have an added value to stakeholders? And I'll open this up to anyone, even non-speakers that want to join. Feel free to raise your hands and mention anything you have experienced in the past.
Can I come in here, Yoshim? Because
yes, sure.
I had research funding, but I also have funding which comes from UK aid. So it's the UK government really that provides this funding. And this is really implementation projects. These are not really research projects. So there are tensions in both kinds of funding that you have, because I have been involved in a project where, of course, these projects are determined by government policies. They're determined by agendas that governments have, and these agendas can change. And I was involved in a really big UK aid project, which was going to be for 5 years. And because the UK policy changed and they had cuts in those funding, we were told just through an email one day, 2 years later, that we are not going to carry on with this project, So the government decided that it's going to stop. But I think Flavia has put a really important question in the chat. And there are lots of constraints that funding agencies really put when we are working with partners. And I think maybe what we should be doing really in all opportunities that we're given really to engage with funders is to actually provide feedback back to them. I could see that there has been some change in the UK in terms of funding agencies. I have been involved in 2 projects where the funder actually allowed us a year of funding to actually co-create the partnership and really develop the project before we could go and submit a full proposal for funding. There was no guarantee that we were going to get this full funding, for another 5 years, but at least they allowed us we had the privilege of time to actually develop the project, to actually work with partners, to think about where is this going to, what are we hoping to achieve, and really create this shared vision. So some things are changing, and this was a really positive development in the UK, but of course, not all the funders, not all the funding agencies are treating projects this way. But I think it's really up to us to also push for this to happen, to really get the opportunities that they're giving us through spaces that they are creating, through feedback, through meetings we have with them to actually give this feedback back to them, that this is really essential. And we are really seeing that funders want, and they're pushing for participatory work, and they're pushing for co-creation, and they're pushing for actually projects to be done in a more equitable way. But unless they realize that actually this takes time and this takes resources, and you really need to add this in the project itself, I don't think they're going to change. So I think it's constantly really pushing and providing feedback and really stressing the importance of all this in funding. But yes, absolutely, it is an aspect that really determines lots of these partnerships, the partnership work that and how we could be involved in partnerships really.
Thank you for that contribution. This ties in really well with some of the other negative experience people explained in the past. Once the funding runs out, so the project has to quit and suddenly there's nothing anymore, like it completely stops. Maybe from your experience, Professor Lee, how does it typically happen if we have different stakeholders that are not refugees, or do you typically already have a handover strategy in place when you approach a separate party, or how do you normally approach it?
Could you clarify a little bit what do you mean by handover strategies?
So the question here a bit is like we have projects and typically they're funded for like maybe 5 years, like we said. But after 5 years, the academic project ends, so suddenly there's no more money. And a lot of the times the projects then kind of just disappear into nothingness, or there's no like way to continue working on that. So how do you usually approach it so that the partner still has something to do with it after the funding runs out? I'll first give the word to Professor Lee, and then Evan, you can chime.
Sure. So for how I approach it, right? So with any kind of research partnership, even though we seek out long-term collaborations, it's not a forever collaboration. There's always going to be not just with the funding, but also just a timeline of different interests and things change. So a big part of, at least the way that I approach it, is yes, a lot of times academics bring in funding to this kind of research and help kind of run programs. But with research partnership, I think the value and a big opportunity, and I would actually call it an opportunity and not a challenge, is that it actually gives room for capacity building for the organizations that you're working with, right? And that's kind of the way that I approach it, and that's kind of the way that I approach it with various kind of NGOs, nonprofits that I've worked with. Is like, sure, we have, and it goes back to like, how do we set it up in the beginning, right? And what's the purpose of this research? And especially the field of international development, there's also funders like outside of academic funding who value, right, like data-driven decision-making in terms of like impact. How do you kind of think about results in a more kind of rigorous manner? So what I end up spending a lot of time doing is not only just doing the research as part of the research team, but you also think about and can put in place like who are the people that we're working with, what are the scopes and areas where knowledge transfer to build internal capacity of the organization, so that there is some sort of capacity and ability for the organization or organizational partners to kind of build a culture around like data-driven decision making And a lot of times it comes back to kind of rebuilding and further bolstering your kind of monitoring, evaluation, accountability, learning meal frameworks, right? And we kind of feed it into that for future learning. And we want, and with a lot of like the work that I do is with this research outcomes, we wanted to feed it back into improving programs and improving outcomes. And that helps. And we also have this conversation, okay, so with these kinds of results and with these kinds of findings and the ways that the organization is kind of moving and expanding, right? So how can we also think about and this is not necessarily the role of the researcher, but then for the research partner, especially like NGOs and programs, okay, how can you utilize the findings and this effort when you are kind of looking for funders and looking for funding to kind of fund your projects, right? And talking to donors and stakeholders. So those are some things that I've done that have been quite effective and helpful to kind of sustain some of this work, right? Because the end result of RPP is not just research production, right? That would be a very different kind of theory of change and different kinds of configuration. So we kind of think about those things from the beginning.
All right. Thank you, Professor P, for that one. Evan, do you still want to add something to that answer? Or?
It was actually a question that would take a little more than I could quickly type. Something that had been mentioned in the past couple sessions, like over the last weeks that I've been to, is paying participants what their value actually is. And so not just like a little stipend for participating in research, but a full salary that the work is worth. I don't know exactly how that would go if you index to different nations' cost of livings or so, but the idea of actually like budgeting salary for participants as more than just incentives on top of being a participant. Are there any funding sources that allow that? Is that a thing that's done? I mean, if you're really taking them in, it makes sense that you should be able to include them as funded members.
I think with that question, with funding and budgets and salaries or stipends, I think it depends on the definitions of the scope of the work. And when we talk about participants, who these participants are, right? Are we talking about participants in like the organizations that you're working with? Are we talking about participants, people who are contributing to the research and being interviewees or people that we're serving, right? So those are different layers. But at least from my understanding, if we're saying, let's say like a research partner is working with, a refugee education program and there's this collaborative effort to conduct research on whether it's the efficacy of the program or whatever it may be. And I think a lot of times, right, that research, it's not a one-way street because it's not just the benefit of the researcher. Usually the organization that's partnering with the researcher also has a stake. So they are also putting in some funds, right? I think it's a lot of kind of negotiations and figuring out like, what are the resources that are available, right? And I think it's also quite dangerous if like nonprofits or education initiatives like look to researchers as funding sources for their work. That also becomes quite tricky, and that leads to kind of issues for long-term sustainability. So I'm like a big believer in it should be a two-way street, and both needs to kind of contribute. Financially, sometimes in the process, you need to kind of hire additional staff to be able to do this kind of work. And depending on, like the various funding schemes, sometimes there's been times where I include that into like my own research budget when I'm applying for funding. But that has institutional complexity. And a lot of times if it programs staff of various education NGOs or initiatives, it becomes part of their role, right? And so they have budget to do it. So it's one of those, like those budgets need to come together. And I think it goes both ways. Like researchers shouldn't be looking into the research partner organization as a source of funding and labor, but simultaneously the education organizations or initiatives shouldn't be looking to the researcher as source of funding to be able to fund their work. But it's really figuring out, okay, like if we value this, what are the resources that exist we can put into it? Are there and then there are also opportunities, I think, to be able to apply for funding collectively, collaboratively, to be able to hire. And so when you're budgeting and applying for grant proposals, it's actually important to kind of put in that personnel cost into the budget. I think sometimes people forget to do that, or feel like, oh, we don't want to pay someone a salary. But I think it's worth putting it because it's part of the project. It's part of operations costs. So there shouldn't be any like shame or guilt about putting in salaries of people or additional kind of stipends or whatever for participation in applying for grants, and not just covering, program costs and travel costs, whatever it may be.
Thank you. There's actually, I think before we go to breakouts, there's a really interesting question from Lana. The reframe, I mean, step in, Lana, if you want to say it instead of me. But it feels like we've been talking a lot about funding as though it's this force of nature. But I mean, there are people and organizations that create these calls for funding. So how do we co-design research partnerships with funders so funders are equally aligned with the values of participatory research partnerships? That's Lana's question. And if it's still pin drops, I take that to.
I can take that question. I also want to give that to Kula, because honestly, the answer is it depends on the funder. Some funders want to be engaged and in the call for application. Some will be like, please do contact us if you want to have a proposal and talk. A lot of funders don't want to have that earlier conversation. So it really depends on that relationship, right? So I would give some concrete examples. There was one project that was funded, and it was like a co-design between the partner and myself as a researcher and our research team. We applied for kind of like a foundation grant to do it, and they didn't want it. They just wanted to fund it. They didn't want to be a part of it. They're like, you guys do whatever you want to do. We care about social impact, education, innovation. Do it. There was that piece. So that's happened. But there's also other times when. And those are kind of like the more bigger calls for applications. There was another time we were at a conference. There was as a researcher, there was like a practitioner, and then someone from a funding agency happened to all be there. And so we were kind of having a more kind of casual conversation of our work, our interests, and realized that we have a lot of mutual interest. And it was like, oh, it was really, really interesting to study how test beds are forming to innovate and serve in remote areas. How do we use kind of digital remote mobile technology to accelerate learning in rural parts of the world? And so because a funder happened to be there and they're like, this is really interesting, let's actually think about if we can make this work. And so that was like a smaller scale pilot kind of project, but then they were kind of willing to throw money at it and kind of co-design that processes. But a lot of times it's more like the funders just want to fund things, and they don't really want to know the details, or they don't also have the expertise or the capacity to get deeply involved in the co-design process. And I think sometimes that's okay. As much as you want everything to be aligned, people have different interests, and you kind of have to work with what you have and those relationships. So it's really important to kind of think about, okay, what are your relationships? What are your networks? And then and what are some things you can do small scale with very minimal funding, just to kind of show some traction, and then that kind of, I think, kind of give you a bigger case for why people should pay attention to these kind of partnerships and push the needle. Cool. If you have anything else to add.
I think it's very tricky because the funders are accountable to their own kind of like, they have their own outcomes and milestones and kind of like boards that they need to report to. So in a sense, everything is kind of like fitting back to them. So they have their own kind of like agendas in this case. The only example that I can think of is really a project that was funded by the UK government to the Open University by the Department of Health. And luckily enough, they were asking us to have quarterly meetings with them. So we were going to these meetings. They had a very set idea of what they wanted to achieve through this funded project. But because we had the space and we had the opportunity to actually speak to specific people, I think we could negotiate aspects of this project, and we could steer some of the activities in the project towards co-design. and really stressing the value of doing so. So I think at the end, they could see the value. I mean, they're coming back to us now with the idea that that was the best thing you did in that project. And they could really see the value at the end. But it was really a process of 3 years really negotiating and speaking and kind of like pushing for this to happen. And it was quite a small scale, as you say, Sarah. So I think it's kind of like making use and taking advantage of spaces that maybe funders are giving us. And I mean, that's one example. In the UK, most of the people who are setting really the kind of like programs and kind of like ideas of funding and where funding is going is academics, that they are part of like committees and boards, and they are invited to contribute to this. So again, it's kind of like a collective position in the sector, isn't it, to be able to push for this and feedback to these funding bodies. So I think that's all I can think of now. But it's a really good question, Dana, and maybe something that we should be striving for, really.
Yes, Lana, feel free.
Yeah, and if I may just jump in, I mean, I was interested, and thank you both for your responses. I've been really thinking about, you know, how do we have a more inclusive relationship with funders, not seeing funding as, this sort of invisible hand or black box, this sort of force that acts against or with us, but to where we can invite in the conversation. And as you both express, you know, different funders have different relationships to their grantees, but I think the more of, even if we know what their agendas are, map out what outcomes, values matter to them, and then where that aligns to the researchers and practitioners, and, you know, towards that opening diagrams of kind of who's in those circles. You know, funders should be in those circles. And I think it's the more we inquire on what they're interested in, what their values are, I think the more that we can kind of develop that relationship. So that's where often we think of funders as a sort of outside group that's, you know, creating forces within the system, and it's more, how are they seen as really part of the system, and how do we build a relationship? So thanks for taking the time to answer the question.
All right, Evan, I think that brings us to the next part of the talk today. Can you introduce the breakout rooms? I think you're muted, Evan.
I was muted. What I was saying is water break. It's been a lot of listening and sitting and talking. Go stretch your legs for about 5 minutes. We'll come back. And when you're back, we'll do a poll. We'll decide which breakout rooms we'd like to have. And then we'll start the breakout discussions. So the breakout discussions we'll have afterwards are going to be based on things that came up in the discussion. So go reflect, stretch, get a drink, and we'll see you back in about 5 minutes.
All right, everyone. I hope you all had good discussion in the separate breakout rooms. Now, I would like to invite someone from every room to maybe give like a 1 minute highlight of things they enjoyed from the breakout session. Now, maybe from the first, the breakout room that I was a part of, maybe Lorraine, would you like to share a 1 minute highlight of things we discussed?
I guess we were sort of talking about what are mechanisms we can use to make the learners not feel as though they're used in this and they're a subject. And Mohammed was talking about how he's from, being from the community doesn't necessarily make it easier because it makes it slightly easier, but it still doesn't eliminate the imbalance because you're still being seen as different because you have you're coming with a research agenda. And then we were left to the room thinking about when researching interventions, how can we get the learners or the participants to co-create the interventions in which we're researching? And that's why we never got a chance to finish that question.
No, that's a conversation we'll need to pick up next time. Is there somebody from the other room that would like to share some of their experience?
It would have been great if Emmanuel could share his experience, but I don't know, he got lost in translation. Somehow when the breakout room ended, he didn't appear back in this main room. I guess I can say a couple words on anyway. So it sounds like he is working at an organization in Malawi, but he's now doing his master's in Italy. And the organization in Malawi has a partnership with a US university. He didn't say which one. And so to find funding, that was our topic. The university is doing a fair bit also to help build the image and the visibility for their organization. But something that we hadn't talked about before in the main call that he brought up is networking, and how he tries to network on LinkedIn, and he didn't yet, that's right about where it cut off, but how he was doing networking to find the funding and be seen by funders, because he brought up that a lot of funding proposals are written for a particular organization, but then made public because they have to be. So he's kind of saying like it's helpful to go on the in. I don't know if he's planning to be the people they write that for, but to be met and recognized by funders.
All right, so that leaves us to the closing parts of our session today. So I would like to thank you all for attending. There is one final thing I would like to share. All of you who are here indicate that you're very interested in learning more about these types of things or finding other organizations with similar goals. Now, we created a Google form. It's completely optional, but if you do fill it in, I'll post it in the chat. Or my colleagues already posted in the chat, which is amazing. If you do fill it in and you can provide like a short bio, your mail, and what kind of collaborations you're looking for. If you submit it, we'll compile all that information and share it with the other participants of this event, so that later on you can actually contact and maybe continue the wonderful discussions you've been having today. So I hope to see many responses. And once again, I would like to thank all our amazing speakers. I would like to thank the technical hosts that have been making all these possible. And I would like to thank all of our participants. Without you, this session wouldn't have been as fun as it was today. So thanks for attending, and I hope to see you all in the few remaining events that still happen during the Migration Summit.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Yoshi and Ivan. Very nice to meet you all.